Riders in the Chariot by Patrick White. Welcome to the first of my series on the books that have influenced me over the years. These are books that I've returned to at least once to read again, and sometimes I've read them several times. And the first one that I want to talk about today is Riders in the Chariot by the Australian author Patrick White. Now, Patrick White's the only Australian ever to win the Nobel Prize in Literature, but I suspect that he's largely unknown in Australia these days. If you stop people in the street, they probably wouldn't have any idea who Patrick White was. His best-known novels are probably Voss, and this one that I'm going to talk about today, Riders in the Chariot. This is one of the few of the books that I'm going to talk about that I actually own a physical copy of. This is a very old copy. I think it probably dates back from my high school days. Tiny print, very close line spacing, and the paper's turned quite brown. This book, Riders in the Chariot, was singled out for special praise at the Nobel Prize ceremony. It was published in 1961. I read it in year 12 at high school in 1973, which was the year that the Nobel Prize was awarded to him. So that's probably why it was on our reading list for the year. I was 17 years old at the time, and I've since reread it several times at different periods of my life. The book is largely set in the suburbs of Sydney in the 1950s, so in the early years after the end of World War II. It goes back in time, though, to tell the backstory of the main characters. And those four main characters are Mary Hare, Mordecai Himmelfarb, Ruth Godbold, and Alf Dubbo. These characters are linked by a common mystical spiritual experience. This unites them but cuts them off from mainstream society. It's important to take a moment to understand this experience, the experience that White uses. He uses this image of the chariot in which the four characters are riders. He uses this to describe or visualize this spiritual experience that they share. The image goes back to a vision of the Old Testament prophet Ezekiel, a vision of the chariot or perhaps of the throne of God. This is found in Ezekiel chapter 1, verses 1 to 28. I'll just read the first of those verses. As I looked, a stormy wind came out of the north, a great cloud with brightness around it, and fire flashing forth continually, and in the middle of the fire, something like gleaming amber. The description goes on for quite a while. He sees four creatures who are human in appearance, although each of them has four faces and four wings, so perhaps not so human looking. And each is described as being associated with a wheel that touches the earth. The description becomes very confusing, and I defy anyone to actually depict what he describes, though some have indeed tried. For instance, Raphael tried this rather tame version. William Blake tried this. Here's another drawing, and here's another image. It can't really be done if you try to depict it literally. Now, this image of the chariot is also linked with the god Apollo from Greek mythology. Apollo drove a chariot across the sky each day to bring light to the world. It was pulled by these fiery horses. Other images come into play as well. The pillar of fire that guided the Israelites through the wilderness. In Jewish mysticism, this becomes associated with the Shekinah, the divine presence or glory in the world. There's also the fiery furnace in the book of Daniel, in which four figures are seen to walk unharmed through the flames. These are all images that are used to describe the experience that these four people share. It unites them, but divides them from the community. They become marginalized, or perhaps they have this experience because they are marginalized. These people are set apart because they see something beneath the surface of, or perhaps which transcends the normal mundane life that most people live. And for this reason, they're seen as a threat. If you pay too much attention to these people, you may begin to see between the cracks. So let's take a look at each of these four characters. The first of these is Mary Hare. It's not entirely clear when Mary was born, perhaps at the end of the 19th or in the early 20th century. Her parents travelled Europe when she was young, and there are hints, I think, of the jazz age in the background as she grows up. She has very little formal education, as far as I can see, very little social contact with the outside world, and very little parental supervision. She seems not to be loved, although there are hints later in the book when some fragments of her mother's journal are discovered that the mother did try very hard to love her, but really in the end just couldn't manage it. Mary is always described as ugly, poorly formed in some way, pudgy, lumpy, muddy, and her parents find it difficult to connect with her. Perhaps they're ashamed of her too. She is animal-like. The name Hare is no accident here. To quote from the book, she was at most an animal, at least a leaf. As I said, she has little formal education, but nevertheless she knows things. She has a connection with the natural world. This is what she knows, not in some intellectual way, but in a sensual, visceral way. Twigs, leaves, shadows, insects, stones, animal remains. This is her language. She crawls through the scrub even when she is quite an elderly woman and everyone regards her as mad. She lives in the crumbling ruins of the extravagant fairy tale mansion that her father built, which he calls rather pretentiously Xanadu. This of course brings to mind Coleridge's poem Kubla Khan. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, which in turn references Shangdu, the summer capital of Kubla Khan's Yuan dynasty in China, a place of beauty and opulence. But when it's plopped down in the middle of the suburbs of Sydney, it becomes, of course, somewhat ridiculous. By the time of the story, this mansion is literally falling down around Mary. Mary has this experience of the chariot, usually at sunset. It seems to be her primal innocence, her lack of education, the sense that she is a blank page. It seems to be this that renders her particularly susceptible to this experience. One point that White seems to be making throughout the book is that there's not one particular type of person who has this experience, and there's not just one path to this experience. Each of the four main characters represents a different path. This is how White describes her experience of the chariot as she watches at sunset from the terrace of her house. And sure enough, the wheels began to plough the tranquil fields of white sky. She could feel the breath of horses on her battered cheeks. She was lifted up, the wind blowing between the open sticks of fingers that she held extended on stumps of arms, the gold of her father's bloodstone ring echoing the gold of trumpets. Interestingly, on one such occasion, her father comes close to experiencing this too. He's a deeply flawed and troubled man who attempts to take his own life several times, including on one occasion when he tries to shoot himself in the head while Mary is looking on. But he somehow manages to miss and at the same time manages to appear foolish. There seem to be people like him who come close to the experience but just fail to realise it. These people seem to detect the lack in their life, and they either sink into despair or madness or bury the experience beneath the layers of the mundane. Mary thinks of her father that she had seen him twitch the veil. But this experience of the chariot is not an entirely pleasant experience. It's not some kind of airy-fairy woo-woo experience. As Mary comments to one of the other four, Ruth Godbold, at one point, "Did you ever see the horses? I haven't yet, but at times the wheels crush me unbearably." Mary, like the other Illuminati, is seeking the centre of things, and for her this involves being stripped away to nothing. Eventually I shall discover what is at the centre if enough of me is peeled away. And eventually that's what happens to Mary. After the events at the climax of the story, more of that later, she simply disappears. Some think she's left, some think she's taken her own life, But Mrs. Godbold believes she's still around, merged in some way with the natural world. And the subsequent demolition of Xanadu seems to mirror this. She and the ludicrous house were somehow connected. The second of these main characters, these riders in the chariot, is a German Jew named Mordecai Himmelfarb, who survives the Holocaust and goes through all the hell that you can imagine that implies. One defining event in his life takes place on the night of 9th to 10th of November 1938, a night that would go down in history as Kristallnacht, Night of Broken Glass. This was the night that Nazi leaders unleashed a series of pogroms against the Jewish population across Germany. Himmelfarb, whose name incidentally means colour of the sky or colour of heaven, is walking home that night from work. He's a highly educated man, a professor. He's walking home and he senses that something is wrong, although he observes no concrete evidence for this. Himmelfarb is often driven by feelings and intuition, sensing situations, in some ways sensing the future, sensing what's to come. So he turns aside from his walk home to seek out an acquaintance, again without any clearly formed idea of why. When he arrives at this person's home, they assume he's there to seek sanctuary, there to seek a way out of Germany, which they'd previously hinted at. However, they don't realise that Himmelfarb is married. And it's only when Himmelfarb mentions his wife that he himself realises what he's doing. Realises, in fact, that he's been on the verge of abandoning her and that he's left her at home unprotected. When he returns home, he finds the home ransacked and his wife gone. For this, he feels unrelenting guilt, and throughout his subsequent life, he's seeking redemption. It becomes more than just a personal quest for redemption, though. He perceives himself as having some kind of destiny, and others, including his wife, had expressed the idea that they felt that he was destined for something great. Ultimately, Himmelfarb ends up in Australia in the fictional suburb of Sarsaparilla in Sydney. He takes on a menial job at a factory that manufactures bicycle lamps, run by a man who calls himself Harry Rosetree, but is actually Chaim Rosenbaum. More of him later. For quite a while, Himmelfarb had become non-religious, but he was also subject to these mystical experiences. The first clear description of Himmelfarb's experience comes when he's walking through the streets of a town in Germany that's being bombed. He'd encountered the concept of the chariot in the course of his academic studies in Kabbalistic texts. The Kabbalah is a form of Jewish mysticism. White describes Himmelfarb's experience thus. Then wheels were arriving, of ambulance, a fire engine. The Jew walked on by supernatural contrivance, for now the wheels were grazing the black shell of the town. The horses were neighing and screaming as they dared the acid of the green sky. The horses extended their webbing necks, and their nostrils glinted brass in the fiery light, while the amazed Jew walked unharmed beneath the chariot wheels. He remains unharmed, but it's nevertheless a terrifying vision. It echoes the experience of the bombing that's going on around him. It's almost as if these two things are one and the same thing. There's nothing exactly comforting about this experience. If it isn't in itself terrifying, it arises out of terrifying experiences, at least for Himmelfarb. And this is the second path that White delineates. You can arrive at transcendence through terrible pain and suffering, through horror. And that is Himmelfarb's path to the truth, just as Mary's path had been through oneness with the natural world. The contrast between Mary, the uneducated simpleton, and Himmelfarb, the highly intellectual Jew, is, I'm sure, quite purposeful. They are very, very different people, but there is a path for each of them. And because they're so different, that path too must be very different. In Australia, Himmelfarb finds himself mistrusted and despised. He's a foreigner, he's a Jew, He's obviously highly educated despite his lowly position. All of these are characteristics that make him an object of hatred and fear to the people of the suburbs, who want only their prefabricated houses and potted geraniums. He is a threat because he reveals the cracks in the veneer. Patrick White's critique of post-war Sydney suburban life is absolutely scathing. And so we come to the third initiate, Ruth Godbold. The name is, of course, significant. Some of those who come to know her reflect later that she is some kind of domestic saint, a domestic goddess of some kind. She was the rock of love, one character says, a woman who employed her as a maid. She is also a Mary, really. She is the mother of the Lord, at least to some extent. That becomes more evident later. Being a mother is part of what defines her. There seems to be an endless stream of daughters, yes, invariably daughters, pouring from her womb. She's almost a type for motherhood, as much as she is a concrete individual. She embodies motherhood. It's interesting to contrast her with one of the secondary characters, a Mrs. Jolly, who also identifies herself first and foremost as a mother, but White says of her, she had a mother's skin. She had a mother's skin, and there was no more to it than that. Mrs. Godbold is more conventionally religious than the other characters in that she actually belongs to a church. But while others might wear this too as a skin, the rose trees do, for instance, in an attempt to disguise their Jewishness, with Mrs. Godbold it's much more than skin deep. Her initial experience of the Chariot also comes slightly differently. It comes to her, in fact, in a church when she's listening to some organ music. For the organ never stopped playing. She had been conscious of it, but only now began to hear. A music of strength and solidity to strain the capacities of the harmonium at home. She had never heard anything like this, and was at first frightened to accept what she was experiencing. The organ lashed together the bars of music until there was a whole shining scaffolding of sound. And always the golden ladders rose, extended and extended, as if to reach the window of a fire. But there was no fire, only bliss, surging and rising, as she herself climbed upon the heavenly scaffolding and placed still other ladders to reach higher. Her courage failed before the summit, at which she must either step right off into space, crash amongst the falling matchsticks, or be lifted out of sight forever. For an instant she floated in the cloud of indecision, soothed by the infinitely kind fingers. So there are hints here of other ideas, like that of Jacob's ladder in the book of Genesis. But essentially for Mrs. Godbold, truth, the centre of things, comes to her through service, through love, through domestic chores, through motherhood, through mundane tasks. We read, in the course of her life, she had developed a love and respect for common objects and trivial acts. But even for Ruth Godbold, this experience is not all roses. When she was a young girl, her younger brother was killed when a hay wain rolled over him, and she had to carry his body home. So we read, sometimes, though, the grey pipes blew blasts that made her shudder, and there was that intolerable hovering note which rounded out her brother's head, crushed by the wheel, and blood still in the sockets of the eyes. I apologise for the graphic imagery, but it's important to see that the experience of the Chariot is dangerous. It doesn't bring peace, or at least not peace alone, not in the first instance. This is not some suburban spirituality of candles and crystals, which is of course another reason why people find these Illuminati so threatening. Ordinary people won't open themselves to this experience because there's a price to pay. Then we come to the fourth of the riders, Alf Dubbo. Alf is an Indigenous Australian boy born of an Indigenous woman and an unknown white man. He's taken away from his mother and raised, at least until his early teen years, by an Anglican priest and the latter's widowed sister. Alf is exposed to very little of his own culture. Unfortunately, and perhaps somewhat predictably, the priest abuses the boy, who runs away and begins a fairly aimless, itinerant life. He becomes an alcoholic, and somewhere along the way he contracts both syphilis and TB. While he is later cured of syphilis, it's the TB that ultimately kills him. Alf shows a very early aptitude for painting, and it's through his painting that he approaches the experience of the chariot. His suffering, especially his TB, seems to play a role in this, elevating him to a kind of feverish state. But it's through painting that the experience of the chariot is realised for him. And this is the fourth path that White explores. We have the path through the natural world with Mary Hare. There is the path through pain and suffering for Himmelfarb. There is the path through motherhood and domesticity, through the mundane for Ruth Godbold. And now the path through creative expression for Alf Dubbo. These very four different people take very different paths to find the centre, to achieve transcendence. Dubbo does actually paint, of course, but even when he's not painting, in some sense he still is. As White says of him, he was painting all the time, except in paint, of course. Painting, whether on the canvas or in his mind, is his way of seeing and seeing into the world. Again, Dubbo was sufficiently sustained both physically and mentally by his vocation to ignore the most part of what people call life. To see how Dubbo finally attains his apotheosis, his transformation into the divine, we need to consider the climax of the plot. Some of the lads who work at the factory with Himmelfarb have had a big win on the lotto, the public lottery. They get completely shickered, that's pissed drunk. And when they come into the factory later, it being Maundy Thursday, the day before Good Friday, they decide to have a bit of fun with Himmelfarb, the Jew. The Jews, after all, crucified Jesus, didn't they? So, in a kind of drunken ecstasy, they decide to hoist Himmelfarb up into the jacaranda tree in the courtyard. There is, of course, a lot of symbolism here. There are nails hammered into the tree, one of which pierces one of Himmelfarb's hands and another his side. And Dubbo is there at the factory witnessing all of this. Eventually someone steps in and Himmelfarb is taken down from the tree. He appears to have some superficial wounds, but otherwise seems okay. Whether he has some deeper wounds that aren't visible, or whether it was simply time, later that day, actually early in the morning of Good Friday, he dies. Word has meanwhile come to both Ruth Godbold and Mary Hare of what has happened, and Ruth takes him into her home to care for him in his weakened state. While he's there, his own home is burned down. Mary, Ruth, and Ruth's children care for him through the night. Now, Ruth here is clearly playing the role of Mother Mary, perhaps with a hint also of Martha about her. Martha from the Gospel story, who offers Jesus hospitality. Her sister Mary, in the meantime, anoints Jesus' feet. Here, Mary Hare lies down, covering his feet. She is this Mary at this moment, and maybe there's also a hint of Mary Magdalene about her. Dubbo witnesses this scene through the window. Specifically, he sees Ruth, Mary, and the others lifting Himmelfarb up from bed in order to make him more comfortable. It's this and the crucifixion scene that finally makes it clear to Dubbo what he has to paint. So, for the next few weeks, until his death, Dubbo locks himself in his room and paints the scene of the deposition from the cross, a popular scene in Christian art. He places Mary and Ruth at the scene because of what he witnessed through the window, although obviously they weren't there at the time of the mock crucifixion. But art, it seems, is truer than fact. He also finally paints the chariot with the four of them aboard. Then he dies. Alf here plays the role of Peter in the narrative. When he's on the bus after the mock crucifixion, the bus conductor asks him, "You know about it? Know the bloke, perhaps? Worked at Rose Trees." To which Dubbo replies, "No, I don't know." Here he is Peter denying Jesus. But more than this, I think Dubbo represents Peter and all the apostles first and foremost as a witness. It was his job to witness and to bear witness, which he does in his painting. What ultimately becomes of those paintings is uncertain, but it's the act of painting, the act of bearing witness that's important here. To complete the allegorical elements of this narrative, I can't ignore the role of Harry Rosetree, or Chaim Rosenbaum, the owner of the factory where this all takes place. He clearly fulfills the role of Judas here, not so much because of his betrayal of Himmelfarb specifically, although he is very slow to acknowledge what's taking place and very slow to intervene, but rather because of his betrayal of his people, of the Jewish people, by trying to hide among Christians. And in fact, Rosenbaum ends up hanging himself in the bathroom. So, throughout this novel, White is contrasting the depth or transcendence of the life experience of these four riders with the plastic superficiality of ordinary suburban life. There are some people who sense this deeper reality, this deeper knowledge or perception, like Mary Hare's father, or maybe even the Rosenbaums, but either they can't quite reach it, they can't quite attain it, which leads to despair and perhaps madness, or they bury it. Most, though, have no sense of any of this. As Mary Hare says of Mrs. Jolly, who works for her briefly as her housekeeper, I don't think Mrs. Jolly sees beyond texture, brick and plastic. Those who can't see it, but see others seeing it, try to destroy them. Anything different is suspect. Nothing must threaten the veneer of suburban life. It must be destroyed. When he's drunk, Alf Dubbo sings, "High digger, high digger." Digger is an Australian term for a returned soldier, originating in the First World War, presumably because they were diggers of trenches. High digger, nail it, nail it. Nail the difference till it bleeds. It's the difference that will bleed the best. And again, Mary Hare says, they will torture almost to death someone who sees into them, even their own dogs. But all of this, even the hatred and violence, remains superficially concealed beneath some kind of suburban etiquette, suburban politeness. When the lads crucify Himmelfarb, it's all seen to be just a bit of fun, just a lark. No harm meant, no real harm done. Boys will be boys. They, the plastic people, will turn on anyone in whom they perceive any kind of difference or weakness. They'll even turn on their own kind. Mrs. Jolly lodges with another widow called Mrs. Flack. They each discover a weakness in the other, a secret from the past, and they begin to torture each other, always, of course, with a smile and a kind word. They murder each other with endless cups of tea. There is, of course, the obvious evil in the world, events such as the Holocaust. But the enemy of the good, the enemy of the riders, is as much mundanity, superficiality, as it is overt evil. So, who are these riders? Well, again, according to Jewish mystical tradition, there are in each generation 36 righteous people, the Tzadikim Nistarim, excuse my pronunciation, those who greet the Shekinah, who greet the glory of God as it's manifested in the world. White is identifying the riders as 4 of these tzaddikim. If it were not for these 36 people, it's believed, the world would come to an end. When Himmelfarb is passively allowing himself to be strung up in the tree, he believes that he's about to redeem himself and to redeem the world. He doesn't, or so it seems, but in a way he does. They all do. Here are some of White's final words about Ruth Godbold. Finally, the woman sitting alone in front of the deserted shed would sense how she had shot her 6 arrows, that's her daughters, at the face of darkness and halted it. And wherever her arrows struck, she saw other arrows breed, and out of those arrows others still would split off from the straight white shafts. White is absolutely scathing in his criticism of post-war Australian suburban life, but within this he perceives its totally undeserved redemption. That comes via the despised, the marginalised, the suffering in society. It's the very people that society rejects and seeks to destroy who keep the world alive. When I first read this book, I was about 17 years old. At that time in my life, I was beginning to ask the big questions. I'd become very interested in religious experience and particularly mystical experience. I felt that I had, in some very small way, sensed something of what Patrick White meant by the Chariot. This book really struck a chord with me. I became particularly interested in Jewish mysticism, and you'll see that in some of the other books that I look at here if I continue with this project. I've remained interested in this throughout my entire life, not so much these days from a religious perspective, but more from a psychological perspective. What do these experiences, and the experiences themselves are quite real, however you might come to interpret them, what do these experiences say about the human mind, about how human beings perceive the world and interact with the world? What do they mean? Do they, or did they once at least, serve some kind of evolutionary purpose? Did they provide some kind of survival advantage in dealing with the world? These are the questions that I've always asked and continue to ask. Quite apart from this, the book is filled with the most wondrous passages of prose. An early pearliness of light, a lamb's wool of morning, promised the millennium, yet between the road and the shed in which the Godbolds lived, the burnt-out blackberry bushes, lolling and waiting in rusty coils, suggested that the enemy might not have withdrawn. This is a modernist text with elements of stream of consciousness and frequently a very broken and fragmented narrative. It bursts into poetry and imagery. It's probably not to many people's taste these days. It's not an easy read, both because of the writing style and because of the narrative content. I wondered, when I set about reading this book again, whether I would still feel the same about it. Well, I think I got even more out of it this time. I think this time I dived into it much more deeply, in a way that I didn't even during our Year 12 exams. I think I know more now than I did then. I have more experience, certainly more than I did as a 17-year-old. One would certainly hope so anyway. So there it is, Patrick White, The Riders in the Chariot. I hope this wasn't too much for you or too boring for you. Well done if you've made it all the way through to the end. If I keep going with this, the next book that I'll dive into will be Sons and Lovers by D.H. Lawrence. Please let me know in the comments if you found this at all interesting, if you managed to get through it, and please let me know also if you think I should continue with this. I almost certainly will for at least one more, so see you next time.